My name is Grace Holloway, and I was 32 years old when my brother handed me a bill at our father's funeral luncheon. Not a sympathy card, not a thank you, a bill. It was folded once, printed on cream paper, and placed beside my paper plate while the church ladies were still carrying trays of fried chicken into the fellowship hall. At the top, in my brother Mark's careful accountant font, were the words, "Estate reimbursement notice." Underneath that, an amount, $48,600. My sister Julia leaned over my shoulder and said, "It is not personal, Grace. It is just what is fair." Fair. I had spent 4 years sleeping in the room beside my father's hospital bed. 4 years checking his oxygen line at 3 in the morning. 4 years washing sheets, sorting pills, arguing with insurance companies, changing bandages, cutting his food smaller when his hands started to shake. Mark visited on Christmas Eve if the weather was good. Julia called every other Sunday from Nashville and said things like, "I do not know how you do it," before hanging up to attend brunch. But at my father's funeral luncheon, they decided I had been living in his house rent-free. They decided I owed the estate. They decided love could be itemized. I looked down at the bill. Room usage, utilities, vehicle access, meal costs, household supplies. Caregiver offset. Caregiver offset. That was the line that made the room tilt. Not because it was the largest number, because it was the smallest one. They had assigned my 4 years of care a negative value. As if every meal I cooked, every appointment I drove to, every night I sat awake listening to my father breathe, had been a debt I owed for the privilege of staying near him, while everyone else stayed comfortable somewhere else. Across the room, people were eating potato salad and whispering soft things about how peaceful Dad looked. My brother stood in his black suit, one hand in his pocket, waiting for me to cry. My sister adjusted her pearl bracelet, waiting for me to argue. My mother had been gone 8 years, so there was no one left to tell them to be ashamed. And my father, Thomas Holloway, the only person in our family who had ever known how to make silence feel safe, was in a casket 2 rooms away. I folded the bill again, placed it in my purse. Then I said, "I will bring this to the will reading." Mark smiled. "Good. That will make everything easier." He thought he had just won. The next morning in a lawyer's office above the old bank on Maple Street, my siblings received everything they believed they deserved. Mark received Dad's truck, the hunting land, and his investment account. Julia received the beach condo in South Carolina and $200,000. My nephew received an education trust. My aunt received Dad's church bonds. Even a cousin who had not visited in 9 years received a check. Then the attorney looked at me. To my daughter, Grace Eleanor Holloway, she read, "I leave my store apron, the brass key sewn into the left pocket, and the ledger from beneath the register." Mark laughed so hard he covered his mouth with the will packet. Julia whispered, "Oh, Dad," as if he had made a sweet, confused mistake. The attorney slid an old canvas apron across the table. Holloway hardware was stitched across the chest in faded red thread. There was a dark stain near the hem from the year Dad dropped a can of walnut finish and said 5 words my mother made him apologize to the pastor for. I touched the apron. Inside the left pocket was a brass key. Inside the ledger was one line in Dad's handwriting. "Shelf 7, red bin, come alone." That was when I understood something my brother and sister did not. My father had not left me scraps. He had left me instructions. Before I tell you what was inside the red bin, I need to tell you about Holloway Hardware. It sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd in Ashland, Kentucky, in a brick building with green awnings, uneven floors, and a bell above the front door that had rung for 72 years. My grandfather opened the store in 1952. My father took over in 1989. By the time I was 10, I could smell rain coming through the door before customers asked for tarps. I knew the difference between wood screws and machine screws before I knew long division. I knew which old men came in for 2 bolts and stayed an hour because their wives had died and the store was warmer than their kitchens. Dad knew everyone. He knew who paid late because they were careless, and who paid late because their water heater had burst 2 weeks before Christmas. He carried charge accounts in a green notebook under the register. Mark used to call it bad business. Dad called it living in a town. I grew up behind that counter. When other girls played with dolls, I sorted washers into coffee cans. When I was 13, Dad taught me how to cut glass. When I was 16, he taught me how to tell a contractor he was wrong without making an enemy. When I was 20, I left for nursing school in Lexington. I wanted something different, not better, different. Dad cried when I packed my car, though he blamed allergies and a shipment of cedar mulch. I became a hospice nurse because I understood houses at the end of things, the way families rearrange furniture for hospital beds, the way adult children become old grudges in kitchen corners, the way dignity often depends on whether someone remembers to warm the blanket first. I worked in hospice for 7 years. Then Dad fell. It was a February morning. Ice on the porch steps. He broke his hip, hit his head, and stayed on the floor for 40 minutes because he refused to wear the emergency button Julia bought him, and Mark said was dramatic. When I got the call, I drove from Lexington to Ashland in snow so hard the windshield looked like static. At the hospital, Mark was arguing with the billing desk about insurance codes. Julia was on speakerphone from Nashville saying, "We need to think about long-term arrangements." Dad was awake, bruised, angry, trying to sit up. I took his hand. He looked at me and said, "Store opens at 8. I said the store can wait. He stared at me. So I added, "Do not make that face. You have a catheter." That made him laugh. 3 ribs hurt when he did. The doctors said he would need help for a few months. Then a few months became a year. Then the hip healed, but the heart failure worsened. Then the tremor started. Then memory came and went like a porch light with bad wiring. I moved home. I told myself it was temporary. Temporary is a word caregivers use when they are not ready to admit the old life is already gone. Mark was the oldest. He lived in Cincinnati, worked in financial planning, and spoke in percentages even when discussing people. He had a wife named Allison, 2 sons in private school, and a house with a kitchen island large enough to land a helicopter. He visited Dad once a month at first, then every 6 weeks, then only when papers needed signing. Mark always brought a folder. That was his way of showing love. Documents, projections, tax strategies. He believed if a problem could not be placed in a spreadsheet, it was probably someone else's responsibility. Julia was 3 years older than me and had turned reinvention into a career. She sold luxury real estate in Nashville and narrated her life online in captions about abundance, healing, and choosing peace. She called herself deeply family-oriented in interviews, which was technically true if family meant old photographs and holiday content. She came home twice a year. She cried beautifully each time. Then she left before cleanup. I was the one who stayed. That is not a heroic sentence. It is just a factual one. I stayed because Dad needed someone. I stayed because the house had stairs he could not manage alone. I stayed because the new night nurse fell asleep twice in 1 week and Dad nearly missed his heart medication. I stayed because every time I tried to leave, I could hear him coughing through the baby monitor I had placed beside my bed like he was my child, and I was his parent, and time had folded itself in half. I quit my hospice job in Lexington and took part-time work at a clinic in Ashland. Nights, weekends, mornings before appointments. I ran Dad's house on lists. Blood pressure, weight, oxygen level, medication, meals, physical therapy, store updates. He still owned Holloway hardware, but the day-to-day management had passed to a man named Pete Alvarez, who had worked there since I was in pigtails. Pete knew more about that store than anyone except Dad. Mark wanted to sell it. Julia wanted to refresh the brand. Dad wanted them both to stop talking. Every Thursday, Pete came to the house with store reports. Dad sat in his recliner blanket over his knees, magnifying glass in one hand. I read him the numbers when his eyes got tired. He asked sharp questions. Even sick Dad could spot a missing decimal like a hawk sees a field mouse. Paint sales down. Big box store ran a discount. Counter it with contractor bundles. Pete already did. Dad nodded. Good man. Mark said Dad was too old-fashioned to understand modern retail. Julia said the store had nostalgia potential. But Dad kept the lights on, the employees paid, and the town supplied with the small things people need on bad days. Pipe fittings, window locks, extension cords, snow shovels, a plunger at 7 in the morning when nobody wants to make eye contact. That was the world he built. Quiet, useful, and impossible to explain to people who only valued things after they were appraised. The first time Mark called me a freeloader, Dad was asleep in the next room. It was Thanksgiving. Julia had come home with a photographer friend who was just capturing authentic family moments for her social media brand. Mark brought wine and a smoked turkey he had not cooked. I had been awake since 4 making mashed potatoes because Dad could still taste my mother's recipe if I got the butter right. After dinner, while Dad slept in his recliner with the game low on TV, Mark stood in the kitchen looking at the cracked tile. We need to discuss the house, he said. I was washing the roasting pan. What about it? You living here indefinitely creates estate complications. I turned off the water. Dad is still alive. Obviously. He said it like I had embarrassed him by mentioning it. I am talking about planning. Julia leaned against the counter, scrolling her phone. It is not crazy, Grace. You have had a place to live for almost 3 years. A place to live. Mark sighed. Do not make it sound ugly. We all appreciate what you do. No, you appreciate that I do it so you do not have to. Julia looked up. That is not fair. Neither is charging rent to the person changing Dad's sheets. Mark's face hardened. Nobody is charging you rent. Not then. But he had thought of it. I saw it in his eyes. Dad's voice came from the doorway. Mark. We all turned. He was standing with one hand against the wall, breathing hard, face gray with effort. I rushed toward him. He lifted one finger. Not at me. At Mark. If you ever speak to your sister like her care is a convenience again, you can explain to the town why Holloway Hardware no longer carries your investment brochures by the register. Mark flushed. Dad, that is not. I know what it is. Dad's voice was weak. It still filled the room. You think money is the only contribution with a number attached. Julia said softly, Daddy, nobody meant. He looked at her. You mean less every time you let him say it. That ended Thanksgiving. Mark packed his wine. Julia posted no family photos that year. That night, after I helped Dad into bed, he caught my wrist. Grace, what? I wrote things down. You have written everything down since 1978. No, his eyes found mine, clearer than they had been all day. The important things. I waited. He squeezed my wrist. When they hand you paper, bring paper back. I thought he meant the medication chart. I was wrong. Dad died on a Tuesday just before dawn. The rain had been falling all night, soft and steady against the bedroom windows. He had been restless around 2. At 3, he asked for water. At 4, he asked if the store lights were on. I told him Pete had it handled. At 4:30, he said, Your mother is going to fuss about the porch. My mother had been dead 8 years. I said, then you better fix it before she sees. He smiled. At 5:10, his breathing changed. Hospice nurses know that sound. The body begins leaving before the room is ready. I climbed into the bed beside him because he had always hated being fussed over from a distance. I held his hand. His fingers were thin. Still rough. Still my father's. He opened his eyes once. Gracie. I am here. I know. Those were his last words. I know. Not thank you. Not goodbye. I know. As if my being there was the one thing he did not have to wonder about. Mark arrived 3 hours later. Julia arrived that evening. By then the funeral home had come. The sheets had been changed. The pill bottles gathered. The oxygen machine removed. The room looked wrong without the equipment. Too spacious. Mark walked through the house making lists. Julia cried in the hallway, where the light was good. I sat on the back steps in Dad's flannel shirt and realized I did not know what to do with my hands if they were not checking something. The funeral was Friday. The church was full. Everyone loved Thomas Holloway. Or maybe everyone loved the version of him that had sold them storm windows on credit and remembered their children's names. Pete spoke at the service. His voice broke when he said Tom did not run a hardware store. He ran a place people went when something broke. That nearly undid me. At the luncheon afterward, Mark handed me the bill. $48,600. Room usage, utilities, meal costs, household supplies, caregiver offset. And that somehow hurt worse than the casket. The will reading was Saturday morning. The lawyer's name was Caroline Voss. She was in her late 60s with short white hair, red glasses, and the kind of calm face that made people underestimate her until she spoke. Her office smelled like coffee and lemon oil. Mark sat closest to her desk. Julia sat beside him. I sat near the window. There were clouds low over the river, the kind that make Kentucky hills look like they are holding their breath. Caroline read the will. Mark got the truck, the hunting land, the investment account. Julia got the condo, cash, jewelry that had belonged to our mother. My nephew got the education trust. Aunt Beth got church bonds. Then me, the apron, the key, the ledger. The room waited for me to be humiliated. Mark did not wait. He laughed first. Julia tried to make hers gentle. That was worse. Oh, Grace, she said. Dad knew you were sentimental. Caroline Voss did not smile. She slid the apron toward me with both hands as if it were heavier than cloth. I was instructed to give this directly to you. Mark leaned back. Is there anything else for her? Caroline looked at him. Number. His face relaxed. He thought the story was over. Then he placed the reimbursement bill on Caroline's desk. There is also an estate matter regarding Grace's occupancy of the residence. I felt heat climb my neck. Caroline lifted the bill. Read the first page. Then the second. Her expression did not change. Who prepared this? I did, Mark said. As executor, as eldest son. Those are not the same office. Julia shifted. Mark's jaw tightened. I will be filing a claim. Caroline placed the bill neatly beside her folder. You may file anything you like. I would advise you to wait 48 hours. Why? She looked at me, then at the apron. Because Thomas Holloway was very fond of documentation. The room went quiet. Mark's smile faded by half an inch. I picked up the apron. The canvas was soft with age. The brass key was sewn into the left pocket behind a patch. The ledger was small green and rubber-banded closed. Inside the first page, Dad had written, Shelf 7, red bin, come alone. I knew exactly where Shelf 7 was. The plumbing aisle. The old red metal bins were where Dad kept unusual fittings no one else carried, because he said a town needed access to odd solutions. I stood. Julia said, Where are you going? I looked at Caroline. She gave the smallest nod. Then I said to the store, Mark said we are not finished. I said you are not. Then I left. Holloway Hardware was closed for bereavement, but I had the back door key on my ring. The store smelled like dust rubber paint and rain-soaked doormats. No lights were on except the emergency exit sign near the office. I stood in the dark for a moment and listened. The building settled around me. Every old place has a voice if you have spent enough time inside it. A tick of pipes, a low hum from the refrigerators that held bait in summer, the small creak of wood floors remembering footsteps. I walked to aisle 7, plumbing, left side, third section, red bin. There were hundreds of red bins each with handwritten labels, brass adapters, copper elbows, compression nuts, flange bolts. The bin Dad meant had a label so faded, only someone who knew his handwriting would recognize the D as his. Odd thread. I pulled it out. Inside were pipe fittings, dust, and a small envelope taped to the bottom. Grace. My hands started shaking. I opened it. There was a bank deposit box number and another key. The brass key from the apron was not for this bin. It was for something else. The note read, Take both keys to Caroline. Do not call your brother. Do not answer Julia if she cries. Dad. I laughed and cried at the same time. Do not answer Julia if she cries. He had known. Of course he had known. I drove back to Caroline Voss's office with the apron on the passenger seat. She was waiting. No surprise, just a fresh cup of coffee placed across from her desk. You found the bin, she said. Yes. Good. She opened a drawer and removed a sealed packet. Your father established the Holloway Stewardship Trust 3 years ago. He waited to tell you because he believed your siblings would pressure you before he was gone. What is the trust? Caroline slid the packet across the desk. It owns the Holloway residence, Holloway Hardware. The building the store occupies 2 rental duplexes on Oak Street, the warehouse property outside town, and the investment account associated with business operations. I stared at her. What? Your father transferred those assets legally while he was alive. They are outside the probate estate. But Mark got the investment account. He received your father's personal investment account, not the business operating reserve. How much is this worth? Current conservative valuation is just under $9 million. I looked down at my hands. They did not look like $9 million hands. They looked like hands that had changed sheets and opened pill bottles. Why me? Caroline's voice softened. Because you stayed. The words were simple. They hit harder than any inheritance amount could. She continued, Your father tracked your caregiving hours. He documented missed work, unpaid labor, medical coordination, household management store, continuity assistance, and personal financial losses. She opened another folder. Inside were charts, receipts, calendars, my handwritten medication logs copied and tabbed, clinic schedules, mileage, emails from Mark saying he was too busy, texts from Julia saying she could not come. My chest tightened. Dad had saved everything. Caroline tapped the file. Thomas anticipated your brother might attempt to characterize your care as a debt to the estate. The trust includes a caregiver compensation provision. I could barely speak. What does that mean? It means the estate owes you $48,600. That was what Mark said I owed. Caroline's number was different. 4 years of documented caregiving. Lost wages. Nursing services valued below market rate because Dad insisted on being conservative. Mileage. Household labor. Administrative medical coordination. Emergency overnight care. The total was $237,000. I read it 3 times. Caroline said, Your father did not want you paid while he was alive because he knew you would refuse. So he placed it in the trust as a required disbursement upon his death. I do not want money for taking care of my father. I know. She folded her hands. He knew too. That is why he made it mandatory. I covered my face. The room went blurry. For 4 years, my family had called me lucky. Dependent. Stuck. Too emotional. They had built an entire story where my care was proof that I had failed to build a life. Dad had built a different record. One where my care had value. One where staying was not weakness. One where love did not cancel labor. Caroline waited. Good lawyers know when silence is part of the document. Finally, I lowered my hands. What happens now? We open the deposit box. Then we notify the family. What is in the box? Your father said you would know what to do when you saw it. The bank was across the street. The box required both keys, the brass key from the apron, and the small key from the red bin. Inside was a video drive, a stack of original trust documents, the deed to the house, the store ownership certificates, and one handwritten letter in Dad's blocky script. Gracie, if Mark gave you a bill, show him mine. If Julia cried, remember that tears are not always truth. If you are angry, good. Anger is the part of grief that still has a spine. You did not live with me for free. I lived longer because you stayed. You gave me 4 years in my own house. 4 years of coffee by the kitchen window. 4 years of hearing the store bell when Pete came by. 4 years of being your father. instead of someone's problem in a facility. I cannot repay that. But I can refuse to let them cheapen it. The house is yours. The store is yours to protect, not to sell, unless protecting it requires that. Pete will help you. Caroline will guide you. And if your brother talks about fairness, ask him what he thinks a night of sleep is worth when someone else is listening for the oxygen alarm. I love you more than I ever said correctly. Dad. I sat in the small bank room holding that letter to my chest, while Caroline looked out the window and pretended not to see me break. The family meeting happened Monday at Holloway Hardware. Not at the house. Not in Caroline's office. The store. Dad's place. Caroline sent formal notices. Mark objected immediately. Julia said it felt aggressive. I said nothing. At 2 o'clock they arrived. Mark in a gray suit. Julia in a cream coat. Allison behind Mark, face tight. Julia's husband Brent beside her, already looking tired. Aunt Beth came. Pete Alvarez stood behind the counter in a clean flannel shirt, hands folded over the register. Caroline stood near the paint desk with a projector and a stack of folders. I wore Dad's apron. That was not planned, at least not by me. I had picked it up that morning, intending to bring it as evidence. Then I put it on and could not take it off. Mark looked at it and scoffed. Is this theater? Pete said, careful. Just one word. Mark looked at him, then away. People who think they are powerful often forget who knows where all the screws are kept. Caroline began. Thomas Holloway established the Holloway Stewardship Trust 3 years ago. The trust owns the Holloway residence, Holloway Hardware, the store building 2 duplexes, the warehouse property, and the associated business operating reserve. Mark interrupted. That cannot be right. It is right. My father would not cut me out of the store. He did not cut you out of the will. He separated the store from the estate. Julia's voice was thin. Who controls the trust? Caroline looked at me. Grace Holloway is the successor trustee and primary beneficiary. No one laughed this time. Mark turned to me slowly. The color had drained from his face, leaving only anger. You manipulated him. Pete moved 1 step away from the counter. Caroline said Thomas recorded a video. The room went still. She pressed play. Dad appeared on the screen, mounted above the paint section, sitting in his recliner, thinner than he had been before the end, but clear-eyed. Mark, Julia, if you are watching this, I am gone, and you are probably angry. A few people shifted. Dad continued, I love you both, but love is not the same as trust. You treated your sister's care like it was something she owed this family. It was not. It was a gift to me. Mark stared at the screen like it had betrayed him. Dad's recorded voice filled the store. Grace kept me home. Grace kept this store informed. Grace gave up wages, sleep, privacy, and years. I watched you both call that failure because it made your absence easier to live with. Julia began crying. Dad looked straight into the camera. If Mark hands Grace a bill for living in my house, Caroline has my ledger. Compare numbers. Caroline did not smile. I almost did, Dad continued. The house belongs to Grace. The store belongs in trust under Grace's stewardship. Pete has the right of first consultation on any sale or major restructuring. Employees are protected for 24 months unless there is cause. If anyone contests the trust, their inheritance is frozen until resolution. If anyone tries to evict Grace, their gift is redirected to the Ashland Caregiver Relief Fund. Mark whispered. Dad's face softened. Gracie, if you are wearing the apron, stop crying. I was. Everyone saw. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. Dad said, You did good, kid. Keep the bell ringing if you can. If you cannot make sure whatever comes next, help someone who needs a door unlocked. The video ended. The store was silent. Outside, a truck rolled past on Maple Street. The bell above the door moved slightly in the draft. Mark turned to Caroline. I will challenge it. You may, she said. But the no contest clause is enforceable, and your father's capacity evaluation was completed 2 months before he signed the final amendment. Julia sat down on a stack of mulch bags. Her cream coat got dirty. For once, she did not notice. Mark looked at me. "You would take Dad's house from us." That sentence finally did what his bill had not. It made me angry enough to speak clearly. "You tried to charge me rent for caring for him in that house. That is not. You put a dollar amount on the light bill, but not one on the nights I slept in a chair beside his bed." His mouth closed. "You called it fair," I said. "Now we are using Dad's numbers." Allison, Mark's wife, whispered Mark stop. He did not. "This store will fail under you." Pete laughed. Not loudly. Just once. The kind of laugh that comes out before respect can stop it. Mark turned on him. "You have something to say." Pete nodded toward me. "She knows more about this store than you do. I have managed portfolios worth, and I have watched you ask for metric bolts in the wood screw aisle." Aunt Beth made a small coughing sound that might have been a laugh. Julia covered her face. Caroline closed her folder. "The trust is active. Grace's caregiver compensation disbursement will be processed this week. Mr. Holloway's reimbursement claim against Grace is without foundation." Mark looked at the bill in his hand. For the first time, he seemed to understand paper could cut both ways. The aftermath did not explode. It spread. Mark filed a preliminary challenge, then withdrew it when his attorney explained the no contest risk in words even Mark respected. His investment account distribution would freeze. The hunting land transfer would stall. The legal fees would begin immediately. Numbers finally protected me from the man who only respected numbers. Julia sent me a text the next day. "I am sorry you felt unsupported. I stared at it for so long the screen dimmed." Then I wrote back. "I did not feel unsupported. I was unsupported. Those are different sentences." She did not reply for 3 days. Then she sent, "You are right. That was new. Not enough, but new." The caregiver disbursement hit the trust account that Friday. I did not touch it for a week. It felt strange, like being paid for breathing beside someone you loved. Pete found me in the back office staring at the paperwork. "You okay?" "Number." He nodded. "Good. Means you are not Mark." I laughed. He set a cup of coffee on the desk. "Tom wanted you to have a life after him. Do not insult the man by refusing it." So I paid off my credit card, paid the medical bills I had put in my name because arguing with insurance had been easier than explaining to Mark, set aside taxes, put money into retirement for the first time in 4 years. Then I bought a new mattress. Not a car, not jewelry, a mattress. Because for 4 years I had slept with one ear open and my spine curved toward a monitor. The first night on that mattress, I slept 9 hours and woke up crying because rest felt like betrayal. It was not. Rest is what happens when the alarm finally stops. Running Holloway Hardware was not romantic. People think inheriting a business means sitting in an office making decisions while sunlight hits your face in a cinematic way. Mostly, it means the toilet in the employee bathroom breaks on a Tuesday and the supplier sends the wrong snow shovel handles before the first freeze. It means learning payroll software. It means listening to Pete explain margin on paint thinner for 40 minutes because apparently paint thinner has drama. It means 3 employees looking at you to see whether the owner's daughter is going to ruin the place. I did not pretend to know everything. That helped. At the first staff meeting, I stood by the register in Dad's apron and said, "You all know more than I do. I am here to learn before I change anything." Denise, who ran accounts and had smoked exactly 1 cigarette every lunch break since 1998, narrowed her eyes. "Do you mean that?" "Yes, we will find out." And they did. They tested me with small truths. The snowblower rental prices were outdated. The key-cutting machine needed replacement. Mark had tried to push a private label supplier that would have hurt quality. Julia had once suggested turning aisle 4 into a lifestyle display wall. Pete still looked traumatized when he said that. I listened, took notes, asked questions. Dad had left me a store, but the employees taught me how to keep it alive. A month in, I rehired a part-time clerk Dad had let go during his worst health year. 2 months in, we started Sunday afternoon repair workshops for widows, renters, teenagers, and anyone else who had been told practical skills were for someone else. 3 months in, I met with the community college about certification classes in the warehouse building. The idea came from Dad's letter. If you cannot keep the bell ringing, make sure whatever comes next helps someone who needs a door unlocked. I wanted to keep the bell ringing. I also wanted more doors. Julia came to the store in April. No camera, no cream coat, just jeans, a sweater, and red eyes. I was restocking drawer pulls. She stood at the end of aisle 5 and said, "I do not know how to talk to you anymore." I slid another handle onto the peg. "Try honestly." She flinched, then nodded. I was jealous. I kept working. She continued, "Not of the store, not the house, of the way Dad looked at you." My hand stopped. "He depended on you." "Yes." "No," she said. "That is not what I mean." He relaxed when you walked in, like the room was handled. He never looked at me that way. I turned. "Did you ever handle the room?" She looked down. "Number." The answer hung between us. "Ugly. Clean. Useful." Julia wiped her face. "I told myself you stayed because you had nowhere else to go. It made it easier not to come." "Did you believe that I wanted to?" That was the most honest thing my sister had ever said. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded paper. A check. $10,000. I stared at it. "What is that?" "My part of the funeral luncheon expenses, and some of the grocery money I should have paid when Dad was alive." I did not take it. "Julia, I know it is not enough." "No, it is not about enough. I need to do something." I thought about that. Then I said, "Write it to the Caregiver Relief Fund." Her face changed. "There is a fund. There will be." She nodded slowly. Then she smiled through tears. "Dad would like that." "Yes," I said. "He would." Julia wrote the check again at the counter. Denise processed it with the expression of a woman pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. After Julia left, Denise said that was something. Was it enough? Number. She stamped a receipt. But enough is not always where people start. Mark took longer. Mark always took longer because he believed delay was strategy. He did not visit the store for 6 months. He communicated through attorneys about the challenge he never filed. He sent one email asking for transparency regarding asset stewardship, which Caroline answered with 23 attachments and a reminder that he had no managerial authority. Then his son Caleb came in. Caleb was 16 tall, embarrassed by existing, and nothing like Mark when Mark was watching. He stood near the nails, pretending to browse until I said, "You need something." He looked around. "Mom said Grandpa used to keep pocket knives here." "Case knives, aisle 2. He followed me. His eyes kept moving across the store. "I did not know it was like this." "Like what?" "Real." I almost laughed. "It is very real when the toilet breaks." He smiled. Then his face got serious. "Dad said you stole it." There it was. I took a breath. "What do you think?" He looked down at a red-handled pocket knife in the display. "I think Grandpa was not easy to steal from." That sounded so much like Dad I had to look away. "Caleb bought the knife with his own money. Before he left, he said Dad misses him." "I know. He is just bad at being wrong." "That is not rare in our family." Caleb smiled a little. 2 weeks later, Mark came in. He wore jeans. That was how I knew Allison had influenced the visit. He stood near the paint counter, hands in his pockets. Pete saw him and disappeared into the back with the subtlety of a man who wanted to listen from behind plywood. Mark said Caleb bought a knife here. "I know. He carries it everywhere. That is what boys do with pocket knives until they lose them." Mark looked toward Dad's old office. "I have been angry." "Yes, I thought Dad punished me." I leaned against the counter. "Did he?" Mark's jaw worked. "I do not know. That is probably worth sitting with." He nodded once stiffly. Then he pulled an envelope from his jacket. I did not touch it. He placed it on the counter. I withdrew the reimbursement claim formally. My attorney sent Caroline notice This is a copy. Okay. And I made a donation to the Caregiver fund Julia told me about. That surprised me. How much? He looked uncomfortable. 48,600. The exact number. The bill. I looked at the envelope, then at my brother. That does not erase it. I know. Do you? His eyes lifted. For once, no calculation. No, he said. But I am trying to. I believed that much. Not more. Not yet, but that much. 1 year after Dad died, we opened the upstairs apartments above the hardware store. They had been storage rooms for decades. Old paint signs, broken shelving boxes of discontinued handles, Christmas decorations from the 90s. We converted them into 3 small respite suites for family caregivers who needed to stay near loved ones receiving treatment at the hospital or hospice center. Nothing fancy. Clean beds. Small kitchenettes. A recliner in every room because caregivers sleep in chairs more than anyone admits. We called them Tom's rooms. Julia handled the website for free. Not for exposure. For free. Mark did the fund accounting and sent monthly reports with no commentary. Pete installed the shelves. Denise picked the curtains because she said my taste was depressing but sincere. The first guest was a woman named Marlene, whose husband was in hospice and whose house had flooded after a pipe burst. She stayed 9 nights. On the 10th morning, she came downstairs, stood by the register, and said I slept last night. That was all. I went into Dad's office and cried so hard Pete knocked, once heard me and walked away. Some grief is private. Some gratitude is too large to receive standing up. That evening after we closed, I sat behind the counter in Dad's apron. The bell above the door was still. The store smelled like cedar metal and lemon cleaner. I opened the old green ledger. Dad had written more than instructions in the back pages. Notes, names, ideas, things he wanted done if there was time. There is never enough time. On the final page, he had written, Grace will think she is not ready. She is. Not because she knows everything. Because she knows when she does not. That is who you trust with keys. I pressed my hand over the words. The brass key sat beside the ledger. For months I had thought the key opened a deposit box. It did, but that was not the real door. The real door was the story Dad left me about myself. Not freeloader, not failed nurse, not unpaid daughter. Not the one who stayed because she had nowhere else to go. The one trusted with keys. If you are listening to this while caring for someone, or after caring for someone, or while wondering whether anyone sees what it cost you, I want you to hear me. Love is not less real because it is unpaid. Labor is not less valuable because it is done for family. And care is not free just because the person giving it refuses to send an invoice. There are families who will accept your sacrifice and then call you lucky. There are siblings who will praise your strength because it excuses their absence. There are people who will hand you a bill for the house you kept standing while they were away. Do not let their math become your truth. My father left me an apron, a brass key, and a ledger. My family laughed because they thought those things were small. They were wrong. The apron reminded me who built before me. The key opened the proof, and the ledger showed that my father had counted every hour they refused to see. My name is Grace Holloway. I am 33 now. I live in the house my father left me. I run Holloway Hardware with people who know the difference between price and value. Above the store, 3 rooms stay ready for caregivers who need 1 night of sleep before going back to the hard work of love. Mark does not call me a freeloader anymore. Julia does not film family moments without asking. And every time the bell above the door rings, I think of Dad saying, Store opens at 8 as if ordinary work could hold the world together. Maybe it can. Maybe that is what family should be. Not a bill handed across a funeral table. Not a fight over who deserves the biggest piece. But a light left on, a key in the right pocket, a ledger that tells the truth, and someone who stays when staying costs more than anyone else is willing to count. My name is Grace Holloway, and I was 32 years old when my brother handed me a bill at our father's funeral luncheon. Not a sympathy card, not a thank you, A bill. It was folded once, printed on cream paper, and placed beside my paper plate while the church ladies were still carrying trays of fried chicken into the fellowship hall. At the top, in my brother Mark's careful accountant font, were the words, "Estate reimbursement notice." Underneath that, an amount, $48,600. My sister Julia leaned over my shoulder and said, "It is not personal grace. It is just what is fair." Fair. I had spent 4 years sleeping in the room beside my father's hospital bed. 4 years checking his oxygen line at 3 in the morning. 4 years washing sheets, sorting pills, arguing with insurance companies, changing bandages, cutting his food smaller when his hands started to shake. Mark visited on Christmas Eve if the weather was good. Julia called every other Sunday from Nashville and said things like, "I do not know how you do it," before hanging up to attend brunch. But at my father's funeral luncheon, they decided I had been living in his house rent-free. They decided I owed the estate. They decided love could be itemized. I looked down at the bill. Room usage, utilities, vehicle access, meal costs, household supplies. Caregiver offset. Caregiver offset. That was the line that made the room tilt. Not because it was the largest number, because it was the smallest one. They had assigned my 4 years of care a negative value, as if every meal I cooked, every appointment I drove to, every night I sat awake listening to my father breathe, had been a debt I owed for the privilege of staying near him, while everyone else stayed comfortable somewhere else. Across the room, people were eating potato salad and whispering soft things about how peaceful Dad looked. My brother stood in his black suit, one hand in his pocket, waiting for me to cry. My sister adjusted her pearl bracelet, waiting for me to argue. My mother had been gone 8 years, so there was no one left to tell them to be ashamed. And my father, Thomas Holloway, the only person in our family who had ever known how to make silence feel safe, was in a casket 2 rooms away. I folded the bill again, placed it in my purse. Then I said, "I will bring this to the will reading." Mark smiled. "Good. That will make everything easier." He thought he had just won. The next morning in a lawyer's office above the old bank on Maple Street, my siblings received everything they believed they deserved. Mark received Dad's truck, the hunting land, and his investment account. Julia received the beach condo in South Carolina and $200,000. My nephew received an education trust. My aunt received Dad's church bonds. Even a cousin who had not visited in 9 years received a check. Then the attorney looked at me. To my daughter, Grace Eleanor Holloway, she read, "I leave my store apron, the brass key sewn into the left pocket, and the ledger from beneath the register." Mark laughed so hard he covered his mouth with the will packet. Julia whispered, "Oh, Dad," as if he had made a sweet, confused mistake. The attorney slid an old canvas apron across the table. Holloway hardware was stitched across the chest in faded red thread. There was a dark stain near the hem from the year Dad dropped a can of walnut finish and said 5 words my mother made him apologize to the pastor for. I touched the apron. Inside the left pocket was a brass key. Inside the ledger was one line in Dad's handwriting. "Shelf 7, red bin, come alone." That was when I understood something my brother and sister did not. My father had not left me scraps. He had left me instructions. Before I tell you what was inside the red bin, I need to tell you about Holloway Hardware. It sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd in Ashland, Kentucky, in a brick building with green awnings, uneven floors, and a bell above the front door that had rung for 72 years. My grandfather opened the store